Welcome to the Unfolding Thought Podcast. My name is Eric Pratum. Today, I'm talking to Shannon Watson, Executive Director of Majority in the Middle, an organization dedicated to bridging political divides and promoting effective governance through relationship building and practical cooperation. Shannon and I discuss the challenges facing American democracy today, from the erosion of bipartisan cooperation to the societal impact of declining trust. We get into how political polarization is reshaping community dynamics, the importance of local engagement, and steps each of us can take to rebuild trust and effective governance at all levels. Shannon's insight is rooted in her extensive experience and her passion for pragmatic solutions. Our conversation gave me a little more hope for our future, and I hope you will get some of the inspiration I did from Shannon. And now I bring you Shannon Watson. Shannon, thank you for joining me. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely, Eric. Thanks so much for having me. So let's see. I currently live in Minnesota. I say I'm a Minnesotan by choice. I'm a born and bred Kansan. Um, so very attuned to the Midwest. I spent some time in Kansas, some time in Colorado, and then some time in Minnesota, where I've been for the last 15 years. Um, I am currently the executive director of an organization called Majority in the Middle, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And let's see, what else about me? I am the oldest of three girls, and man, I check all of the psychological boxes of oldest child. I got to try out all the rules, and I'm the rule follower, and a lot of approval through achievement kind of psychological profile. Um, and I have a dog named CJ who is extremely spoiled. And yeah, that's me. So, Majority in the Middle, it's a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. If you know, some people know and care about the difference of the different C's. They're really all just tax statuses, but sometimes they tell you a little bit about the organization. But we are working on overcoming political polarization. Now, whether or not that's actually an achievable goal is debatable, but it's probably the easiest way to explain what we're trying to do. Um, we have three sort of focus areas. The first one is being a space for people who feel like they're in the political middle and they kind of want to engage, but they don't feel comfortable uh, on one side or the other. We have people. One of the main questions that people ask us is, well, what do you mean by the middle? How do I know if I'm in the middle? And we generally let people sort of self-define that for themselves. They self-identify. So for some people, that means that they say that, oh, well, I'm on the right or I'm on the left, but I'm kind of moderate. So they think of themselves as the middle. There are some people, full disclosure like myself, who hold some positions that are generally on the party platform for the right and some that are on the left. And so I used to say that I'm on nobody's team, and now I say I'm on everybody's team. So that puts me in the middle because I'm not 100% on either side of that fence. Um, and then there are people, and this was really surprising to me. There are people who believe in what we're doing and participate. They are sort of very stringent in their ideas, right and left. These are my beliefs. These are my values. These are how I see the world. But they understand that governing, not necessarily campaigning, but governing is something that we sort of have to do in the middle. That's where the compromise and the collaboration happens. And so that's sort of the third middle people who really, in any other context, wouldn't really identify as part of the middle. But our door is open to anybody who wants to sort of come in good faith. So that's first thing, kind of creating that space. Sometimes that's a metaphorical space, sometimes it's a physical space. The second thing we do is we try to elevate the behavior that we want to see. And this is primarily from elected officials, but from, quote unquote, normal people as well. That's you know, legislators that are working across the aisle or people who are in bridging work, who are just kind of modeling the behavior we want to see. A reality of human beings is what is rewarded is what will continue. And so, particularly with elected officials who are now having to live in this attention economy, we feel like if they are just getting attention for the really divisive things that they're doing, those are, they're being incentivized to do that, and those things will continue. So we try to do kind of the opposite. We don't like I don't walk around the state capitol in Minnesota telling people, "Hey, can you please not be so partisan? Like, can you try to get along?" Like, number 1, nobody's gonna take a meeting. That's not fun. It's not gonna change anybody's behavior. But what I can do instead is, I've got some PR background, is point to the people who are doing it right. I almost never ask journalists to do a story on Majority in the Middle as an organization. But what I can do is say, "Hey, Minnesota Star Tribune, these 2 legislators over here are working across the aisle on something that's really it's not making headlines, but it's interesting and they're working together on it. Can you do a story about that?" Because we want that to be upheld as something good. And so that's what we do. Try to encourage people's good behavior by giving them acknowledgement and encouragement into that. A friend of mine said that I don't have kids, but he said that I apply gentle parenting to legislators. Okay, and then so the third thing bucket that we do is we work on sort of structural and sort of infrastructure type things, rules, customs, behaviors, to try to make our society not quite so politically polarized. One example of this is sometimes, when you, and it differs from state to state. It differs in Congress. We spend very little time on Congress because like that's like my 15-year plan. Like let's fix the states first and then we'll look at DC. Um but sometimes when you go into a room and it's like all the Republicans sitting on one side of the table and all the Democrats sitting on the other side of the table, and you walk in the room and it feels kind of antagonistic. That's partially because it's designed to, because you have this, you're over here and you're over here, and so it's sort of opposition. What happens if you mix it up? Sometimes like it seems silly to pay attention to like where people's chairs are, but at the same time, if being in sort of close physical proximity to people, if that allows you to build that building block of relationships, then sometimes those things can help. So we look at those issues as well.
I am nowhere near as experienced in this area or as informed as I believe you are. So please correct me if I'm wrong here. But while politics and culture, and we can describe high level aspects of the United States or the world, and we can attribute, we can assign different words to them, but just really being broad. While politics has changed over centuries, in the United States, I believe that one sort of key turning point that a lot of people point to at, I guess, the national level, but I believe it's had an impact at the state and state level, perhaps, is in the 90s, if I recall correctly, Newt Gingrich advocated for uh, representatives to not live in Washington, D.C., and instead to go home for the weekends. And I believe that a number of people have pointed to this as a time when reaching across the aisle, so to speak, started to break down because you didn't have some socializing or playing on the, I don't know, congressional softball team or something like that occurring. And whether that's the right instance to pick on or not, I do feel like I have heard that there have been these key milestones, perhaps in recent decades, where after that point, something changed or it has become harder for people, our legislators, to work together. And Do you feel like that has changed over time, whether because of media or because of specific decisions? It has actually become that the Republicans and the Democrats or whoever are sitting on opposite sides of the table or opposite sides of the room and have a lack of willingness or ability to work together just more and more over time?
I do That's a great question. I do think that the biggest challenge that we have is um, when the only time that legislators see their colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it is in, like, a committee hearing or a floor session or social media, whatever, because those are very performative spaces. That's where they have to go and say their piece or ask their probing question of somebody and make a point and do the thing. Um, Most people who, at least in my experience, most people who serve an elected office, they know when the camera is pointed at them and they have the things that they have to say. Um, and that's often usually not out of a response to the opponents, but it's more in response to their supporters and the people that they see as their constituency. Um, because your friends are often way meaner than your enemies are. Um, and so when people feel like, okay, well, I have to be on the record supporting this, or I have to use this phrase, that's generally a nod to their base constituency. And so if that is the only experience you have of a colleague, you can sort of get the idea that that's who this person is. But that's really sort of the most extreme social media ish version of that person. That's not, you know, the person who's having a turkey sandwich for lunch, and as benign as that could be. Um, we talk a lot about uh how it's hard to hate up close. And so the more that uh people can find those silly, like, just bland personal, you know, things that are similar. Um those are really the building blocks of relationships. It's not, "Hey, I agree on this policy and let's work on this policy together." It's, do you see each other as human beings? Do you see each other as, you know, Eric and Shannon, not representative and senator, those kind of things. So so one of the things that we talk about is how can people interact with cameras off. And, like, in Minnesota, the legislators each have offices, but um they're separated by wings and floors by party, which means, the only time they see each other is in committee or on the floor. They don't always use the same elevator. They don't stand in the same line in the lunchroom, when everybody's, like, microwaving their lunch. They don't have those little things. Um, if you the people that you sort of share space with, and whether that is in an academic setting or in your workplace, um, the people you share space with, and this may be some of the, why it's so important that companies feel like they're calling their people back to work, and they talk about collaboration, but, like, that doesn't really hit the mark. I think what they're really going for, and what we're sort of trying to encourage in legislators, is just getting to know the person to person and having the little snippets of conversation. Like, if you work in an office and somebody gets a flower delivery, something really good or really bad has happened. You will learn that about somebody. If you can see somebody's desk and the pictures that they have hanging on the wall, you might see the picture of them with the giant fish. Maybe you also like to fish. That is a sense of common. That is something you could talk about that has nothing to do with politics. That is that building block of relationships. And so I think those are, as to go back to your original question, when people aren't encouraged to spend more sort of off-camera time together and they're, like, go back into the districts, which, like, there is some there is some benefit to that. You do have more contact with your constituents, but you have less contact with your colleagues, and I think you're right. I think that's where, um, some of that extra polarization sort of sits in because you don't know those people as well.
It has been a long time since I've thought about this particular research, but you're reminding me of research that I believe was done by Robert Putnam around, I think it was in the early 2000s. I will link to it in the show notes, but if I recall correctly, they found in their research that the the most heterogeneous communities were actually the communities where there were the lowest levels of trust. And Robert Putnam spent years before he and his collaborators published this research because he felt like the gut reaction to it would be, see, diversity has failed. And so they did a lot of research to find out, why is it that when you have a diverse community, on average, the levels of trust that people would state when asked, "Do you trust your neighbor?" essentially, was half of what it was in the most homogenous communities. And what they found after doing a lot of research was that just being around someone who is different, but not actually interacting with them and coming to feel like you are a part of something together, just further cemented whatever it was that you thought about that label or this label or whatever. And so if I have someone who's very different from me, whether it's in appearance or accent or who knows what, that lives right next door, whether we talk or not, if I don't feel like we are a part of this neighborhood or we are a part of this state or something together, then I am very likely to continue to feel however I felt about that label that I apply to them. And you're reminding me of this because it's not just, I think, I would love for you to correct me or give me your take, but as I understand it, it's not just about being around the person, right? Having your office next to them, as much as it is that when you walk down to the lunchroom or whatever, you see something about them or you hear them say something and you are able to then see them as being a person just like you that happens to have concerns, maybe just like you, or they're interested in fishing or whatever, despite the fact that they're on the other side of the aisle, or despite the fact that they are female and I am male.
Right. Or they're from another country or they have a different sort of socioeconomic status. Yet um, the human instinct to form in groups and out groups is I mean, this is like part of our evolution. This is in like the reptilian part of our brain. And it comes from, uh, like caveman times where different could have meant dangerous. So we naturally gravitate towards people who are like us. And that's one of the reasons that when we experience somebody who is different, our brains try to find things that are similar. And if you don't have that opportunity, if you just, to your point, like if you have a neighbor who is different than you and you never talk to them, not only are you not having the opportunity to find those commonalities, but you also have this really weird, like awkward kind of I don't talk to you. I'm around you, but I don't talk to you. You must not like me. You must, we never think like and I live in Minnesota and that has the reputation for, Minnesota nice, which is the people in Minnesota will give you directions to any place but their own house. Which I actually haven't I I'm kind of torn. I haven't had the experience, but I also am kind of an introvert. And so when people say, "Oh, yes, let's have plans. We'll make some plans and we'll have dinner someday soon," and then we never do. I've there. There are 4 girls who I went to high school with in Kansas who have also we also live in the Twin Cities. We have never gotten together. Actually, I think a couple of them have gotten together independently, but I've never gotten together with them, and these are people, like, I went to school with, and I have known one since, like, 1st grade. So it's just it's sort of a culture thing, but, a lot of people are just like, "What?" Like, I'm gonna have a neighbor right next door who I don't talk to. I don't ever think, "Oh, I don't have a relationship with that person because I'm the awkward one, or I'm the secretive one, or I'm the unfriendly one." It's to your point is, "Oh, it's that stereotype is exactly what I've heard, and yes, that person is unfriendly or secretive or whatever."
What are some of the strategies or the exercises, I guess, that you go through in order to bridge some of the gaps and foster sort of a genuine or productive dialogue between people who might be on opposite sides of issues?
That's a good question. One of the things that, I mean, other than like, I have a lot of individual conversations, with legislators, and mentioning, like, if I'm talking to somebody about an issue that they're working or whatever, sometimes I say, "Hey, have you talked to other person so and so? They were working on something similar or whatever," and just sort of, serving that. Here's some information that you may not have had because you don't necessarily have a super tight relationship with this person. And if you want to act on it, great. One of the things that we do organizationally is what we call our State of Bipartisanship report. And this report, this will be the 3rd year that we've done it. The first year, it started as something completely different, and it turned into this thing. We were trying to answer the question because there's this sort of, it's not really a myth, it's just like this belief in Minnesota that if you're a member of the minority party, you can't even get your bill heard. Like, that's a thing. In some states, there's a limit on the number of bills that can be introduced, and they all get committee hearings, like, no matter what. In Minnesota, that's not the case. So there was just this belief, and so a new lobbyist asked me the question in early 2023, said, "Hey, is this actually true?" And I said, "Well, I don't really know. Like, I've known people who are in the minority party who have been able to get laws enacted, but I don't know if it's, statistically significant or if those are just one-offs or what the deal is." So we started counting just the bills that were getting hearings. Like, who is the chief author? Are they Republican or Democrat? Just trying to keep an accounting. And 2023, there was an enormous amount of legislation that was going through. So this was actually a terrible year to start this project because the way we were doing it, we had to do it all by hand. And I mean, there was something like, I want to say 3,700 bills got individual committee here. I have the mother of all Excel spreadsheets doing this because what we figured out really quickly was that just who the lead sponsor is of a bill, Republican or Democrat, that doesn't actually tell the entire story because you can have a whole bunch of legislators who sign on to a bill. And who the lead is, there's usually some strategy behind that, either, depending on the district or if they are in leadership or if they are sitting on a particular committee, whatever. Like, there's a lot of sort of stuff that goes into that. So we went back and instead of just looking at, who the chief author is, the red versus blue, and you're like, okay, what's the total authorship of this bill when it got a hearing? And what we found after we like sort of put all this stuff together was that if you look at the red versus blue story, you have sort of an outcome, you have a story to tell. But when we incorporated all of the authors, we had the red, we had the blue, but then we also had this huge swath of purple in the middle. And Minnesota, over the last 10 years or so, has had a sort of a love affair with omnibus bills, which are each committee puts together one giant bill of all the bills. And those honestly usually pass or fail on party lines um, because all the good stuff is thrown and all the bad stuff is thrown in with the good stuff, depending bad or good, depending on which side of the aisle you're sitting on. um, the majority party will generally load up their good stuff that they want. Sometimes they put some stuff that the minority party would want in there to try to get the minority party to vote for it. That very rarely doesn't work because to vote for, your little good pieces, you'd have to vote for the other things that you think of as sort of poison pills. So when you get done at the end of the session, we'll have 20 bills that have passed. They will all be party line votes. It seems like everybody hates each other. Everything is a party line vote. There's no collaboration. There's none of that. But what we saw was in the building blocks of the work, was this huge number of people who were working together, and so we called that the hidden bipartisanship that was happening. It was people who were working together on issues. They didn't always get enacted. They didn't always get through. Sometimes they wound up in the omnibus bill. Sometimes they didn't. But we thought that, like, I was surprised, and I look for this kind of thing, but I was surprised to see it. So we figured, like, this is a really important story to tell, that there's all of this work going on, because being in the middle and, like, working across the aisle, the biggest opposition to working across the aisle usually does not come from the other side of the aisle. It comes from within your own caucus. I didn't know this. Like, I've never held an election certificate, but I talked to a whole lot of current and former legislators when I was putting this organization together, and I was just like, okay, what is your experience? What can we do? What is sort of the core root of some of these things? And they were telling me about their kind of horrible experience, because, again, your friends are way meaner than your enemies are. Horrible experience trying to work across the aisle because they were getting pushback from their friends. And so that can be a really sort of lonely place to be, and something that, like, I don't know if I want to try to do that. But it turned out there was a lot of it happening, and so people were a little more willing to sort of step out and step into working together, because they realize I'm not the only one that's trying to do it.
So you promote this, or you publicize it, you make it known through, what was it called? The bipartisan report?
State of Bipartisanship report. Yes. Which is on our website. I'm working on the 2025 version now. We're going to publish it before the end of the month. And so we have an accounting of all the bills that got hearings, and that's whether these bills became law or not. Because I think the process, you can't enact everything, and it's in doing the work that we get good policy. And, like, you can't get good policy unless you have good work, sort of in the formative parts. And so we publish that. We publish, a sort of a page for each committee. Like, here's sort of what to do. And that comes from committee chairs have an enormous amount of authority when it comes to what happens in their committee. They have almost universal control over what bills get heard. And so individual legislators each have a page, and, how likely are they to sign on to a bill that's, just of their own party, or that it's authored by a colleague, or co-sign a bill that's authored by a colleague, welcome other people onto their bills. So yeah, what we wanted to answer a yes or no question, and we wound up with a 300-page report.
And I think, if I'm understanding some of what you said earlier, as well as what seems to me like the rational next step, I guess, from this report, is that a part of your work is trying to make various groups, whether it's the public, or voters, legislators themselves, aware of all of the bipartisanship, all of the issues that are middle of the road issues. That may not be the best phrasing, but I think it's easy to see the tweet or the headline or whatever that, the sound bites get the attention, right? And that's usually the very biting, critical stuff. And it sounds to me like you're trying to let people know, there's all this work that and all this collaboration that is actually occurring, and look at the good that's coming out of it. That's part of what you're doing?
Yes. And, um, like, just letting people know it's happening, because if you ask most voters, normal American citizen voters, they will say, and they do say, because I had legislators tell me, like, I go to the door and I hear door after door after door, "Can't you guys just get along? Can't you figure it out?" And that's partially because the rest of us have to figure it out, you know? This is the only job where, I mean, think about it, like, if you went to work and kinda hated on half of your coworkers just because of which department that they were in. I mean, nobody goes to work is like, "Oh, okay, well, accounting outnumbers the marketing people, so the accounting people are in charge of everything, and the marketing people are just gonna kinda try to throw sand in the gears and talk about how terrible the accounting people are." Or somebody's gonna send a tweet about how what Andy from accounting is such a terrible human being. I'm like, normal people do not get to do this. Whether we want to or not, we do not get to do this. And, our elected leader representatives, this is seen as okay. Like, it's kind of nonsensical when you think about it. And I think it's one of the reasons that average people get so frustrated with legislators and legislative bodies at Congress. Like, why can't you guys just figure it out? Everybody else has to figure it. Like this just gridlock doesn't it doesn't work. Um, so I think part of it is letting people know that even though all the social media you see and all the traditional media you see is about the fight, is about the conflict. Oh, there's a lot of work that's happening that's exactly what you want to happen. It just doesn't get the headlines. And so, the other thing that we try to do is, like, we very purposely don't do a scorecard. Like, every legislator in Minnesota has an individual page, and we sort of report on their activities. Bill authorship it's like that's the deliverable of being a legislator is enacting laws and working on laws. Like, that's their job. And this is just a small piece of sort of overall bipartisanship, because bipartisanship is kind of a fuzzy concept. It's highly relationship based. It's very, very objective, subjective. And so, this is one thing that can be counted, which was important to me because, the organization that I represent was very young at the time, and so we were like, "Okay, we need something that is absolutely objective and absolutely defendable that we could, come up with, if we were gonna say, well, here's what's going on." But we acknowledge it's just a little piece. Little piece. You could have somebody who looks like the most bipartisan person on the thing, and they could be, like, a terrible human being to interact with, like, that occasionally happens. Or vice versa. You could have somebody who is super collegial and it just sort of doesn't show up in the numbers. I mean, that happens. But one of the things that we want to do is let average people who have tuned out because they're like, all these people do is fight. I don't want to be part of that. Like, I want to buy my groceries and take my kids to soccer and watch my TV show and, go to work and live my life. I don't need all that negativity. Let them know it isn't necessarily all negativity, and remind them that if you do want your legislators to, and that's city council or state or Congress or whatever, like if you want your elected representatives to work together and cross the divide and figure this out, you kind of need to tell them that, because they usually only hear from people who want them to do stuff. And that's either we want you to, advance this agenda, or we want you to stop the advancement of this agenda. Those are the people that they hear from. They don't hear from the vast majority of Americans who just want them to get along. And so sometimes letting the normal people know that there is some of that. You're not seeing it on TV. There is some of that.
It seems to me that when I believe that all that the politicians are doing is bickering, or they can't get anything done, or it's all negative in one way or another, that drives me, whether I'm on the left, right, or center of an issue. Let's just make it super simple. I'm on one side. I'm all on one team. And it just drives me away from any ability to believe in collaboration, and also perhaps suppresses any potential future participation, such as voting, for example. And so the easier we make it, the more that we promote stories or headlines of that are the sound bites or the tweets, so to speak, the more the less people are involved in the process at the end of the day, because the vast majority of people who I believe do hold shared opinions and values, they just don't realize it because they
Yeah,
don't use the same terminology, or because they've never talked, or they don't realize it for any number of reasons. The vast majority of people have just stepped out, and 10% of the people are left. And those are the people who are willing to put up with the arguments or the lack of collaboration. And I think that's implied, but also you got really close to saying that. This is kind of what happens, right? Is people get driven out of participating.
absolutely. Um, so there's a couple of pieces. The first one is you mentioned, people opting out of voting. People are also opting out of running for office and participating. Um, and I mean, like, think about the best person you know, like just the best person you know. And what would happen if you suggested that that person run for office? Like the most of the best people I know, I suggest you should really run for office. They laugh at me and they say, no, 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 no way do I want any part of that. Um, so I think you've acknowledged that sort of the 10% that are kind of participating, they're the 10% that both put up with the current sort of situation and um they're kind of the loudest 10%. Majority in the middle in our name comes from my sort of acknowledgement, like I don't believe that we are actually like, we talk about how, we're so the whole country is super polarized. We've never been further apart than the Civil War, whatever. Um, I don't necessarily believe that we're actually that much further apart. I believe you've got people on side A and you got the people on side B, and in the middle you have this chasm of the people who had dropped out. Like, ugh, I don't want any of that. That's actually part of the origin story of the organization, was the first debate between then President Trump and then candidate Biden in September 2020. I didn't watch that debate. I didn't need to. It wasn't gonna change my vote, and actually, I think I had a meeting that same evening. But anyways, I didn't watch the debate, but I remember watching social media afterwards, and there were some things that I saw that I expected, like the people on the right doubling down on how terrible Joe Biden was, and the people on the left doubling down on how terrible Donald Trump was. And of course, it it shouldn't surprise me. Like it wasn't our side is so great. It was your side is so bad. That's sort of what we're left with right now. And so I saw like a lot of that I expected and was like, okay, this is what I see. The thing that I saw that I did not expect was people who I consider to be very political people. They either, have served in office themselves, they have been legislative staff or agency staff, people who've worked on campaigns, people who, are active in their sort of local party apparatus units, very politically driven and connected people. I saw a whole mess of them, both from the right and the left, say, "Ugh, this is enough." It's like This is gross. This is too much. I'm out. And they were joining that majority in the middle of people who were throwing up their hands and it's like, oh, I can't, I'm out. And that to me was a tipping point was if we are driving out even these people who probably bordered on your 10% of people who could deal with it, if we are driving out even these people, we got to figure something out. And so I was like, I don't necessarily know how to fix this. I've got some inklings. But what I did know was the how to convene and how to put a brand around something. And so it was like, all right, here, we're going to have an organization and we're going to figure this out.
I came upon somewhere, maybe it was your LinkedIn profile or it could have been your website, the statement, the relationships are the work.
Yes.
And as you're talking, it's become very clear to me what you mean by that because I read a little bit into it. I thought, well, you're probably saying this, but we talked maybe 10 minutes ago about actually getting to know people and finding commonality and all that. But then I think even in some of the last things that you said, like it, you don't have a relationship in many senses of the word with someone if you don't talk to them. You can have a relationship in the sense of there's a relationship in your mind with that person who's different from you in one way or another, but not in the way that we typically mean it. And I think some of what you've been saying is the work to get to being able to be bipartisan, for example, is the relationship. That's the work that you have to do. Is that correct?
That's a good analysis. I love it. So the origins of the relationship of the work is I mentioned I'm kind of an introvert, by birth. But I have one of my undergrad took me 11 years, start to finish. It took me a very long time, partially because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I still don't know. I'm 50 years old. I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. But I wound up by the time I got out of school, I wound up with a triple major in English, theater, and psychology because those were three of the five majors I'd had during undergrad. And it was finally what I had enough credits to graduate after 11 years. Uh, if you have kids listening to this podcast, go to school. If you're going to school, get your degree. It doesn't matter what's on paper. Just get out 4 years, get done. Do not go on the 11-year plan. It's very expensive. It does not help you out in life. Anyways, but so like I have learned sort of learned extroversion, not because it comes naturally. It comes from the the theater uh, degree. The other thing that comes from theater, English, and psychology. When I finally got that degree, my dad looked at me and he said, "What are you gonna do with that?" I said, "I have absolutely no idea, but I'm done." Uh, it made 0 sense at the time, but once I really got involved in politics and these kind of things, English, theater, and psychology is actually really good grounding for it's a poli-sci degree without all the history, basically. So I've just naturally very introverted. So my inclination when I do work is to cross off the items on the to-do list. Did I send the email? Did I put together the PowerPoint? Did I, format the spreadsheet? Did I do the thing? Did I, design the thing? Whatever. What I came very, very late to, and I have to credit a former boss of mine, B. Kyle. She taught me that the relationships are the work, and that the conversations before and after the meeting are usually just as important as the meeting itself. The happy hours are important. The how was your weekend is important. Um, because those again, the building blocks of any work you do is going to be those relationships. And it took me forever. Like I always thought, to advance in my career and to be important, whatever, you have to be busy and you have to get so much stuff done and all. And that's not actually the case. It's about people, it's about human beings. So I had a sticky note on my wall for a long time. Actually, I think I still have one around here. It's been through several iterations because at some point the sticky note does dry out. It takes a while, but it does dry out. To remind me that the relationships, the lunch thing, the 5 minutes that I'm spending on somebody's weekend is just as important as the PowerPoint or the other thing.
Can you point to an example where relationship building fundamentally transformed the outcome of a challenge or, helped to produce a bill or maybe even get a bill passed?
So there was one bill that Minnesota legislature was looking at this year. It didn't get enacted yet. Minnesota works on a 2-year biennium, and so the bills that are introduced in the first year, which 2025 is the first year of the 2 years, those, even if they're not enacted at the end of the first year, they travel on to the second year. Um, there were 2 senators who, one Republican, one Democrat, who were working on establishing an office of the Inspector General. Um, Minnesota has been in the news for having a significant amount of fraud happening, started with COVID, and then there have been other sort of situations where there's been a lot of sort of money escaping the state, in ways that is not exactly on the up and up. So one of the things they were suggesting was, let's build this state office of the Inspector General, and the 2 of them worked very, very closely together, and they knew that Minnesota legislature is split as closely as it could be. There are 34 Democratic senators and 33 Republican senators. The House is actually tied for the second time ever in the state, 67 Republicans, 67 Democrats. So of 201 legislators, there are 101 that are Democrats and 100 that are Republicans. And so uh, these 2 senators knew that, they would have a much better shot at getting this thing done if they worked together. And so they sort of made a commitment that they were going to work together to the point that they and staff and a couple of members in the House, of bipartisan members in the House, they met every Tuesday night and worked on this bill. And it wound up passing the Senate 60-7, out of 67 votes, 60-7, which is great. It didn't pass the House yet. But they even sort of insisted on, what we were talking earlier about chief authors and total authorship. The way bills are generally presented is a bill comes to the committee, and the chief author is the one that sits at the testifier table and says, "Mr. Chair, this is my bill. This is the thing." Those 2 traveled as a team, and they would both sit in the testifier and they did it in a way that was highly unusual, to the point like it was really interesting. I had a conversation with the Senate media services, so the people who are involved in the technology of broadcasting all of the committee hearings. The way they have their cameras trained, it's generally just on the person in the middle of the table, and they were sort of having to adjust because they weren't used to having 2 people on camera at one time. And there was some question as to, okay, if you were to make it bigger, like my thing was, I was advocating for them to, if those 2 senators are both sitting at the table, basically, to help tell the story that they're being super bipartisan, and show them both at the same time. And they, rightfully so, said, we try very hard, like, not to sort of frame what's going on. Like, we're just trying to, like, point the camera at what's happening. And they said sometimes if somebody's sitting next to, they don't always know they're on camera, which is true most of the time. But this time it was really deliberate. So they sort of challenged some of the norms and the customs in doing that, but they were also both very sort of committed to, we're doing this together. We're doing this as a group. We're doing this in a bipartisan manner. They had one of the very few bipartisan press conferences in the state. And that's the thing. It's not generally done, but since the 2 of them, they made a commitment to do it together, and they did. And I don't know, like, every time I get the opportunity to cheer them on, because it wasn't easy. They had to challenge all kinds of norms. They had challenge all kinds of pushback from within their own caucuses because everybody wants to be, wants to be that to be their issue and like wants to get the credit for it. And it's no, we're not. It's not just my caucus taking credit. This isn't a Democrat thing or a Republican thing. It's an everybody thing. It's a Minnesotan thing. So I thought that was super cool.
Do you think that Minnesota is a particularly easy or difficult place for the kind of work that you're doing? Or do you feel like maybe Minnesota is representative of what you see in a lot of other states in terms of polarization or bipartisanship?
Yeah, great question. Minnesota is actually highly unusual when it comes to split government. So most states, uh, their governor, their House, and their Senate are a lot of times like, depending on the state, like, it's either a complete Republican control, complete Democrat control. Sometimes, like the legislature is one and the governor is the other or whatever. Um, Minnesota has had a what they call a trifecta when all three are held by members of the same party. Um, 4 times in the last 40 years. The rest of the time, at least one of those 3 legs of the stool has been an opposite party. So it's either been, the House is in Republican control and the Senate and the Democrats are in the control of the Senate and the governor's office are in control of Democrats or vice versa, or, any sort of mix. Um, so like the 67-67 tie that the House is having to deal with this year, highly unusual, threw a lot of things honestly into chaos because they were not like nobody quite knew what to do. The way a lot of things are functionally set up, it's well, if you're in the majority, like remember the majority is the Speaker of the House, and they are the majority leader, and they have certain roles and responsibilities and parking spaces and those kind of things. And then the members of the majority, they chair the committees. They have a lot of people. They kind of run the table and set the agenda. And then the members of the minority party have a choice. They can either try to get stuff done by helping or changing or participating in the lawmaking, or they can try to slow things down and throw sand in the gears and just sort of be the opposition. And this does not matter which party it is that is in the majority. Uh, they have switched roles multiple times over the years. So just figuring out like, okay, we have a tie. We can't like the Constitution calls for one Speaker of the House. Like you can't split that. You can have co-committee chairs, which is what they wound up doing. You can have floor leaders instead of a majority leader and a minority leader, which is what they wound up doing. But even things like the perks, like luckily their office built they're in sort of temporary office digs right now because their office building is it's undergoing a renovation. But even stuff like that, like, oh, if you're in the majority, then you get the top floors of the building. And if you're in the minority, you gotta be on the lower floors. Like those kind of things and all the sort of organizational functions set up were like they didn't know what to do. I mean, there were things they had to change the rules because there are some rules and then actually some laws that specify majority or minority party. And there's no majority and no minority right now. Like it was fascinating. And so what like it was kind of a gift to me because no matter what, constitutionally, you have to have 68 votes in the House to pass a bill. Not even just the majority of people in the room, but a majority of the seats. So 68. So everything that gets passed this year, and I will say, like, they were supposed to be out of session on the 19th of May. They have now blended into a special session time because they couldn't come to agreement uh, by their first deadline. So it's been a little bit of a bumpy process, but everything that the House does has to be bipartisan to get passed. Like it has to be. So that has been sort of a gift from like just my policymaking perspective is that, they're forced to get along, whether they want to or not. Some people are better at this than others. Again, going back to the relationships, some people this is a bigger challenge, shall we say, than it is for others.
You're reminding me of some other arguments, I guess I would call it, not research, from there's a writer, Robert Wright, who wrote, I think, Non-Zero and maybe The Moral Animal and some other books, and probably others have stated this, but I remember encountering this from him. He makes his argument that over time, whether it was minority and majority religions or governments or tribes or whatever, that groups that we have seen become successful very early in their life, they're very accepting of everyone around them because they don't have the power to force their way upon everyone else. So imagine there is a new religion that pops up, you know, you can, of course, rail against the dominant religions, but you're probably not going to win many of those people over if you keep saying how evil they are. And so you look back at any major religion, and he makes this argument that a lot of what you find in their, holy books and all of that stuff is that early in their life, they're fairly moderate or accepting. But then when they get in the majority, that's when you get your, uh, I don't know, like your Old Testament vengeful God sort of scenarios, because at the time that you are now 80% of the population, you can just force your way upon the
Yeah.
remaining 20%. And rarely do you stay in that position, of course, as we know, whether it's politics or who knows what. But you're reminding me a little bit of this because, of course, things change over time. But in a fairly small group like your Senate and legislature, I think was the two,
Stanton House. Mhm.
Senate and House in Minnesota. Okay. You have a state where you have a situation where people could say all the divisive things that they want. If it creates an environment where that person that you're speaking ill of now feels like, I don't want to work with that lady, then it's going to be hard to get anything done. And so I would be, if I was that person who's speaking, I would be perhaps motivated to tone down some of my rhetoric. And I don't know where that leads us in 5 years or 10 years, but at least for now, it sounds to me like Minnesota might be a good environment for then maybe demonstrating to other states or to the country at large that we can work together. And despite the fact that we use different labels for values or we talk about values differently, it turns out that for the most part, we all basically want the same things. And look, it worked here.
Yeah, I would love it um, if you could, uh, share that wisdom with some of the legislators, because they seem some of them some of them are really leaning into this, and I think the people who have sort of the most power right now, like not necessarily organizationally, but for real, um, at least I went into the session thinking the people who are sort of in the middle, those moderates in the party are going to have the best opportunity because they're gonna be the ones that agree, and they're gonna be the ones who are able to be deal makers, um, and hypothetically be the people who to cross the aisle to become that 68th vote on something. Um, what we have seen, uh, from some people again, the loudest, the most fringiest is just doubling down on the disagreement. And then the thing that I wasn't necessarily anticipating, but it makes a lot of sense, is the some of the moderates who are in the swing districts. Like, our House of Representatives just all got elected because they're on a 2-year cycle. So there were a couple of people who were moderates in swing districts, which, moderates and swing districts go together pretty well, because if you have sort of half and half population, then as a representative, you have to, take both of those into consideration. I will say there is no legislator in the country, probably on the planet, who was elected with 100% of the vote. I used to live in a district here who my representative actually didn't have an opponent, and she still only got 97% of the vote. There were 3% of the people who wrote in other people because they were like, "I'm not voting for her." So like everybody has people that they represent who didn't vote for them. And so I think the ones who are super successful in best representing their constituency are the ones that remember that. But that being said, the ones that were in the swing districts who are sort of the moderates, a couple of them got targeted really hard during those campaigns, and a lot of sort of nasty things were said about them, and their words were twisted, and they became the victims of some really ugly campaigning. And it wasn't necessarily done by their colleagues across the aisle, but it was done on behalf of their colleagues across the aisle, and like the party units and the special interests that were aligned with that other half. And so I had a conversation with one of these people early in session, and he said, I'm having a really hard time. I was like, "This is gonna be your year, man, because like this is it. This is exactly what you have been saying that you wanted to happen. You want to work across the aisle, you want to find common solutions and listen to everybody. And like this is your year." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I like logically I understand that." He said, "And the part of me that is so hurt and so angry by the stuff that was said about me, either by these people or on behalf of them, that they didn't stop." It's like, why would I wanna work with these people? And, like, I absolutely get it, and it absolutely broke my heart, because it's like, this is he's one of those people that, I mean, I'm not naming him specifically. Um, he's one of the people that I would be worried would sort of be chased from public service, because he's there for the right reasons, and just sort of being in the middle makes it extra hard for him, because he's kinda always a target, whether that's the people, quote, unquote, "on his own side" who think he's not radical enough, or the people on the other side who really, really want that seat, because that could be the majority making 68th seat in the next election. So, it's hard.
Do you feel like we have a trajectory, whether it's at the level of the state of Minnesota or at the level of the country? We could categorize it some other way. Do you feel like we have a trajectory towards more or less division?
Well, part of me wonders if we can get more divided than we are, and so I don't wanna ask that question, because 'cause I'm sure the answer could be yes. Um, I do think the pendulum swings, so where, the pendulum swings as you get farther over here, then you have a tendency to go farther over the other way. Uh, and that constant swinging back and forth, it's not actually good for anybody. I worked for a chamber of commerce for about 5 years, and advocating for the business community, and that was like our chamber had like super diverse membership. I mean, it was everything from, Fortune 100 companies, you know, global companies, to startups, to people with food trucks, to, like family owned, fifth generation, little company, it was kind of everybody, which honestly made it really hard to advocate for, because everybody was so different. Um, but one of the reasons that business and government have sort of this tension is because when government is, um, when it's on that pendulum swing, and it's sort of reacting back and forth in the push and pull, um, it makes it really hard to plan. Businesses like predictability. Like, they like to know that, okay, this is the situation as it is now. This is gonna be the situation 6 months from now. Here's gonna be a year from now. Because a lot of business, you kinda I mean, you have to react day to day to whatever's happening, but also, like, you need to be able to plan, whether that's inventory or staffing or whatever. You kinda need to be able to plan. And so when the politics gets really swingy, um, then it sort of disrupts that system. And I think one of the things that we're finding more and more as more and more of us are tuned into politics and the questions of democracy and, a lot of sort of foundational things, which I will say, like, this country, we haven't had to articulate our values for a couple of generations. And so, like, I think we're kind of having that experience. It those opportunities usually come with a big war, which hopefully we can skip that part. We can just have the sort of philosophical discussion. Um, but but the unpredictability seems to be affecting normal people in the way it's been affecting the business community for a while. So I think the inclination that we would have to sort of everybody moderate their stuff. Now that doesn't necessarily mean everybody change their values, change their opinions, whatever. But even just moderating our tone, I think would be really helpful. I'm not necessarily sure that we have the infrastructure to do that. And I do think sometimes people bring up, money in politics. And isn't that the root of all evil in politics is the money in politics? And I don't necessarily feel like the money that goes to candidates is not really the problem because the money that candidates get generally pay for staff. They pay for all those obnoxious mailers that you get from the post office. You get, the TV ads again, which are kind of obnoxious. But in my mind, the scary part of money in politics is the money that goes to organizations and platforms and infrastructure that is designed to divide us. And when that's kind of going, like we're in this sort of constant campaign cycle. And the best way to get people to do stuff, like I don't know how many campaign fundraising emails that you get. They're always super urgent, super end of the world. Send us your money now, or else terrible person thing is going to happen. Like, it's a very good way to inspire people to give their money. It also, I think, does a lot of damage to our collective psyche. Uh, and and so the more we do this, the more that becomes the norm. Not everybody is kind of mentally equipped to deal with seeing these messages 30 times a day. I get like 30 fundraising emails a day. I need to just like unsubscribe, unsubscribe, unsubscribe. But like I kind of need to know what's out there. So when we have these like the campaign arms that are constantly in campaign mode, which means they constantly have to be fundraising, which means we constantly have to be talking about how the world is going to end if you don't send me $5. Like the the fact we all haven't exploded our brains is probably a good thing.
I spent about 10 years working solely with nonprofits, 501(c)(3)s, and doing fundraising. So
So
I both, yes, have developed those things and also, of course, been a recipient. And at one point, I also did a study on political activists and the way that they went about fundraising and, things like there were things that we looked at, like how many of them even have a page on their website or a way in which you can make a donation online. So it was really focused on the fundraising aspect, but it's so interesting how there's so much competition for attention, right? That, I think it was Emerson who said in I believe it was the 1840s when the transatlantic telegraph cable was being laid. He said that the most important thing that would be transmitted through the transatlantic telegraph cable was the statement that Queen Adelaide, who was a German princess, but she was a member of the British royal family, if I recall correctly, because she married in. So Queen Adelaide has the whooping cough. And he said, what is it that anyone in Connecticut or Georgia or whatever is going to do with that information? Nothing. And but the point that he was making was it's now going to be so cheap to transmit information that people will begin transmitting worthless information. Whereas before, when the news had to travel via ship or caravan, along the Silk Road, you had to carry the information in your head, which you can only carry so many facts or political gossip or whatever it is, or you had to physically carry machinery or the latest manufacturing techniques or farming techniques or whatever
Yeah.
it is. And so you only carried on your ship or your camel what was what people were going to pay the most for. So the burden was on the people transmitting the information to whittle it down to what was most valuable to the people receiving it. But as information transmission got cheaper,
Right.
then the burden was on the recipient because now you have 1,000 TV channels and you have social media and who knows what else.
Yeah.
And it's you win an organization, whether it's your local humane society or it is a politician, says, we're sending too much email. Your recipients don't notice that you stop sending email because there's an I believe it's called attentional bias or attention bias, perhaps, that you there's so much information coming in that you think the things that you receive are important just
Yeah.
because they're there. And so, sadly, I suspect there's a pull with the work that you're doing to be a little sensational
Yeah.
when I think what part of what you're trying to do is say, the facts on the ground, when if I go and ask 100 people, do you want X? Or do you believe that children should have education? Or, whatever it is, as long as we avoid a lot of labels, you ask 100 people, should a child be able to get an education of some sort? 93 people are just going to say yes without even questioning it. And maybe it's not 93, maybe it's 85, whatever. It's a vast majority. And so, but to get people to pay attention to that, we almost have to begin playing the media game, right? And I was there with the nonprofit work that I
I was gonna
have
say, you
done.
need to send me
Yeah.
your study. I would love to see it.
Actually, we never published it. And the reason was that we had done some nonprofit industry studies that were very similar. And the results, of course, you can pick out any nonprofit, especially because there's so many small nonprofits, right? And say, well, of course, they should be doing A, B, or C better because they probably have a limited budget and limited staff, and there are too many competing priorities. The same is true in for-profit organizations, except for the fact that very often someone who could be making, whether it's 50,000 or 100,000 or $200,000 a year working in a for-profit business, they're probably making half of that in the nonprofit, and they're probably doing more total work. Maybe not more total work, but a broader set of things for any number of
Right.
reasons. And so it was so easy with nonprofits to say, well, look at all these areas for improvement. And it was worse for the political activists. So there was almost nothing to say except look at all these terrible things.
I have those days occasionally. Look at all this terrible stuff. What is the deal? Yeah.
How do you how do you stay optimistic or motivated when it sure seems to me like, as I said, sort of the reality on the ground, the reality
Yeah.
amongst the majority of Americans, the majority of Minnesotans, it sounds like,
Mhm.
is that we really share a lot of values. We want a lot of the same things despite some labels that we'll put up on things or despite some execution of the
Right.
executional details. But it's hard to get attention for those realities as I'm putting it. How do you stay motivated?
I joke with people sometimes. It's either this or sit on the couch and cry. Like, okay, I could be really depressed about the state of the world, or I can like do something. Luckily for me and my own mental health, I play a very long game and I'm okay with incremental change. Um, but it's interesting that you asked that question because there's a lot of people in the bridging sort of universe, and there's a lot of us doing this work. I have a group that I have lunch with about every once a month or every 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever. And it's a lot of peers from sort of similar organizations. And we have lunch, and the initial sort of thing was, let's hear about what each other are doing. How can we align our snowplows? Which comes from in Minnesota when they and this happens in other states as well. You have the big freeway, and sometimes to clear the snow plows, like this one plows this lane, and then this one is just a little bit behind it and plows this lane, and a little bit behind it, a little bit behind it, and so they sort of clear all of the paths by working together. And so the question was kind of like, how can we align our snowplows and the work that we're doing? Um, and it also like it starts out as sort of organizational kind of thing, and then again the relationships or the work turned into kind of a support group of those of us who are doing really difficult work. But I noticed in the last couple of weeks a lot of information that I was getting from bridging organizations across the country. Everybody seemed to be kind of coming to the same sort of not really a breaking point, but like a frustration level at the same time. Because a lot of people say, "Oh yes, working on the bridging that has to be so fulfilling and has to be so great and wonderful work." And then there are a lot of people who say, "No, if you are not fighting this, you are enabling it." Or whatever, which I don't necessarily like believe. I think there's multiple ways to get to the end goal. And I think the work that we're doing and the bridging is important. Um, but so I was like, there was a lot of people who seem to be coming to this, and so the good thing about social media algorithms is that sometimes it delivers to you the content that you need to see in the moment or you want to see or whatever. And so there was a video, and it was Nick Cave, musician Cave, on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and this was end of 24, end of 23, and he was talking. He had written a letter to somebody who was like, "How in the world can you see? How do you see the good in the world?" And one of the things that he said, like I put it on my phone because it resonated with me so much. And so part of this letter that he read was, unlike cynicism, hopefulness is hard earned, makes demands upon us, and can often feel like the most indefensible and lonely place on earth. Hopefulness is not a neutral position, it is adversarial. It is the warrior emotion that can lay waste to cynicism. And I was like, oh my God, I love that so much. Like, because occasionally I'll have people say, "Oh, your rose-colored glasses, those are so cute," and sort of metaphorically pat me on the head. Like, um, I've been called political Pollyanna more than once in my lifetime. Um, and and so that really resonated with me. This is not naivete. It is not, you know, not understanding what I'm up against. But it's deliberate choice to to be very strategic in the work that I do and the work that other people are doing. And sometimes it's just really helpful to to sort of recalibrate your mental health by focusing on the positive. It's very easy to focus on the negative if you want to. There's plenty of opportunities out there. So yeah, that comes from me. And um, I think the uh, the origin story of me and this work, it comes from my parents because my dad is what I've been calling a legacy Republican. He's been Republican for a very long time. There's a significant military tradition in his family. My mom, having grown up in rural Kansas, is either a Democrat or a libertarian, depending on the day and the issue. And so I literally learned bipartisanship at the dinner table growing up. We got all the door knockers, like my parents they weren't in like super political roles. They were very sort of politically adjacent jobs. My mom was a journalist and my dad was in law enforcement. And so this idea that started percolating up the last couple of decades that, people people would be more unhappy with their child marrying somebody of a different political persuasion than a different religion. That used to be the opposite. Um, this idea that you can't be in relationship with people if you don't vote the same is so foreign to me. And so this is just, what happens when, they had me. They're going to be on 55 years of marriage in about 4 days. So I have had that example put in front of me every day of my life. And yeah, so I mean if that's the legacy, if that's what drives me, then so be it.
I think that you you definitely come across to me and your organization as well, even before we spoke, as having a positive vision of the future.
Yeah.
You know, I think that any politician that it might very well claim that they have a positive vision of the future. That is why they are doing whatever it is that they're doing. But it sure seems to me that when a lot of what I hear is not so much proposing what we can do and where we can go together as much as it's more like that guy over there put us in a really bad situation. And my proposal is just to it is not to go somewhere. It's just kind of get us out of this situation. There's no positive vision of the future as much as it's backwards looking. And it's that thing is bad. It remains bad. Let's stop it somehow. And your organization, when I looked you up, really kind of struck me as aligning with that letter
Yeah.
from Nick Cave, I think it was, that, you know, a lot of people have said some version of where there is no vision, the people perish. I think that's
Yeah.
the quote in the Bible, if I recall correctly, but other people have said it. And, um, the idea is that when people think that tomorrow there's a very low likelihood that tomorrow will be better than today, people tend to become complacent and they stop working together and they pull back and I take care of me and mine.
Yeah.
But when I have an idea that tomorrow will be better than today, and in particular, it can be better because of what I do, then you and I still might vehemently disagree. And maybe even I think you're evil, whatever it is, but I'm going to keep working.
Yeah.
And hopefully I can inspire people with my vision of tomorrow can be better because we need to do something. I just don't think it's very inspiring when it's really not about tomorrow. It's a lot about yesterday.
Yeah, that can be very motivating because again, you're tapping into our sort of primal fear and anger. And you point it at another person or another party and say, that's where your lot in life comes from. Um, it's very motivating. But to your point, and also like, we wonder why we have a mental health crisis in this country, and there's a lot of reasons. Um, but I think we've kind of been doing it to ourselves. And going back to the thing about political fundraising and, being angry and being afraid and like people lean into it because it works. And I f- I'm wondering at what point are we going to lean out of it because it works? Like, back in the 1960s when there was subliminal advertising on TV, like you can't do subliminal advertising anymore. Like I'm sure somebody's figured out how to do it on YouTube or something. But like that wasn't something that you could do because they figured out it's like terribly manipulative. And they decided that that wasn't okay. When are we going to lean into, hey, all this fear and anger is terribly manipulative? Maybe we shouldn't do that. I don't I'm not super optimistic about that, but I have hope. And I think some of that has to do with um you're less susceptible to those messages if you know what they're doing. If you're aware of it, if you understand. So some of the civic education that we do, we haven't talked about social media a lot. Like that's the challenge. Like there's 150 things we could do. To your point, C3s, very small organization, very limited resources. Um, but just some civic education and demystifying of government, and of some of these campaign things. Like, yep, you're getting this message framed the way you are on purpose because it's motivating. Um, and like, if you're around it long enough, you can be like, "Oh, yeah, that's what that's doing." And then it's not as effective. So that's one of the things that I think that is helpful just from a education standpoint and, kind of letting people peek behind the curtain a little bit.
Well, whether someone is in Minnesota or they're in Oregon, are there things that you recommend that people do? Uh, are there websites they should check out, whether it's yours or others? Are there places that they should go to connect with you, Shannon?
Yeah. So our website is probably the first place to start for our organization, majorityinthemiddle.com or majorityinthemiddle.org. We own both. They go to the same place. We have a newsletter that goes out. You can sign up for that. You can send us money if you like. That would be lovely. We don't I will tell you, man, the the sort of organizational decision not to do the fundraising with the fear and anger and the urgency, uh, makes fundraising very difficult. But, like, I have a hard time saying, "Hey, like, this is the problem in the world, and we're gonna use it." No! So that's just sort of an aside. Um, but I would say, so there's a couple of resources. Um if you go to our speaking page on the website, I got the opportunity. I was doing a lot of speaking to like Rotary groups and chambers of commerce and a lot of like local groups, and then got the opportunity to do a presentation for a TED Talk, which was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm not somebody who's unnerved by public speaking, so like that was weird. But it's called "Why We're Divided and What You Can Do About It." And so there's very little actually about politics in it. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, you'll hear some of the same things that you've heard on this podcast, but also some things that individual people can do, like taking down your political yard sign when we're not in campaigns. Like the actual like most cities they have a certain amount of time that campaign signs can be up, and it's actually for very good reason beyond just like it, quote unquote, it looks like litter and it's trashy or whatever. But when we leave the campaign signs up all the time, all we're doing is advertising our differences to our neighbors. And that's not helpful when the neighbor across the street or next door, who again might be the different person that going back to when we first started talking, the different person that you haven't quite yet talked to, it's just like, oh, they have a campaign sign in their yard. They must be a terrible person because they're all these things that you don't like. Um, that's not helpful. It keeps us sort of in that constant campaign industrial cycle. So check out that. Um, and then like I said, there are a lot. There's probably 2 or 3,000 organizations across the country that are working on, bridging and division, and so, like, a quick Google search will give you more opportunities than you probably ever want. Um, if you're interested in there are some organizations that teach people how to talk to each other, talk across differences. Um, one of the things that was very important when we put this organization together to me was we're not gonna replicate things that other people are already doing. So, like, Braver Angels is a national organization. One of the founders of Braver Angels is actually here in the Twin Cities. He's a marriage and family therapy professor. He's been a marriage and family therapist and is applying those skills to how people who are, different from each other can talk to each other, talk about politics. Um, those are great. They have workshops all over the country, and you can learn how to do that if you're interested in doing that. Um, but then I think the main thing, like if anybody's going to take anything away, um, is to avoid, you know, all Republicans think this or all Democrats believe that. Because when we put people in the boxes and in the categories and we just assume that, everybody with an R after their name is 100% Donald Trump's agenda, or anybody with a D after their name is, in cahoots with AOC and Bernie or, whatever. Like, like those continue to divide us. And they don't give people the benefit of the doubt, and they don't make any room for nuance or any sort of difference or whatever. And so I think that the biggest challenge when we're talking about political difference, um, is not the stereotyping and just really, like, getting to know people beyond those political things. Because then you can be like, "Okay," like, again, I have the easiest time with this because whenever somebody says something terrible about, well, all Democrats. Alright, you're talking about my mom or all Republican. You're talking about my dad. Like when you can be in relationship and you can, you know, for lack of a better term, you can love somebody who is a member of a political party that you're not, then it makes it a little easier to give people the benefit of the doubt. So, those are the things that I recommend.
I agree with so much that you've said and have appreciated you being here and the work that you're doing. So I hope that anyone that listens to this checks us out, checks you out, and visits your website, maybe even makes a donation to support your work. Or if
Definitely.
they don't, that they find their own
Yes.
organization, hopefully close to home, and do that. So, Shannon, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And well, I hope that we get a chance to speak again.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Eric. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for listening. I hope you got a lot out of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. And please share it with someone you know who'd appreciate this kind of information. If you want to bring this kind of thinking to your own business, check out mine at inboundandagile.com. We specialize in helping leaders with challenges around marketing, communications, and leadership so they can inspire real action in their people and audiences. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll come back for future episodes.